The Mississippi River flowed slowly and wide past the town of Natchez, its muddy waters carrying whispers of trade, power, and sorrow. In the 1800s, this place was both beautiful and cruel. Wealthy planters built large homes that overlooked the bluffs, proud symbols of their fortunes. Cotton money ran through every street, and slavery stood at the center of it all. Behind the fine houses and polite manners was a darker truth. The lives of those who worked the fields and served in the kitchens were bound by chains, even if they weren't always made of iron. The home of one such family stood tall against the rising heat of Mississippi. White columns framed the porch, and every room was filled with polished wood and heavy drapes that shut out the world outside. To neighbors, it was a place of comfort, a home where children's laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses. But beneath that image lived a different story, one only those inside the walls truly knew. Eliza lived there, a young enslaved girl who had grown up in the shadows of her master's house. She knew every corner of the property, the echo of her steps in the hallway at dawn, the creak of the pantry door when she fetched food, the silent chill of the Icehouse that stood separate from the main home. The Icehouse was a square, thick-walled building, cool even in the height of summer. Large blocks of ice cut from distant rivers were stored inside, stacked, and covered with sawdust to last through the season. It was a place meant for storage, but in Eliza's eyes, it always felt more like a tomb. The family who owned her lived in comfort, surrounded by luxury that Eliza herself maintained. The master prided himself on order and control. His wife kept a watchful eye over the household, never letting anything slip beneath her notice. Their children, though young, already carried the arrogance of privilege, looking at Eliza not as a person, but as something between a servant and a piece of furniture. She had her duties from the moment she woke until the hour she was sent to her quarters, and even then, rest came with feared, a first glance. Nothing about their life seemed out of place. Guests visited often, dinners stretched into late hours, and the house glowed with oil lamps that spilled warm light into the night. Yet under that routine lived tension that no one spoke of. Eliza carried it in her silence. She learned quickly that her safety depended on stillness, on swallowing her anger, on hiding her thoughts deep where no one could reach them. But thoughts can't stay buried forever, and hers had begun to surface. There were nights when she lay awake, hearing the wind push against the shutters, wondering what freedom might feel like. There were mornings when she stood in the yard, her hands raw from scrubbing, looking toward the river as if it held answers. Every kindness she gave was demanded, never earned by those who received it. She began to notice how easily they dismissed her pain, how quickly they reminded her that she was not one of them. Her master believed the house was a fortress where every person knew their place. He saw Eliza as powerless, too young, and too bound to ever question him. But in the quiet of her mind, she had already begun to question everything. She knew the cold walls of the Icehouse better than anyone. She knew how the heavy wooden door shut tight, how the air grew heavy inside, how time slowed in that frozen silence. What no one else knew was how much that place haunted her. And sometimes, when anger rose up in her chest, she thought about what it would mean if those who treated her like nothing found themselves inside. Life in Natchez carried on as though the world outside did not exist. The wealthy pretended their way of living would last forever, while the enslaved carried the weight of making it so. Each day that passed, the cracks beneath that illusion grew wider. Eliza felt it in every command barked at her, in every harsh word, in every glance that reminded her she did not belong to herself. Something had begun to shift inside her, a quiet storm forming in the stillness. The house stood proud, the family inside certain of their power, blind to the truth that one among them was no longer content to live as they expected. Eliza moved through her days with the same careful obedience, but behind her calm eyes, the thought of change had taken root. And with every passing hour, it grew stronger, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The days in Natchez carried the same rhythm, but for Eliza, each moment stretched heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Her master's family went about their routines without a single idea of what brewed beneath the surface. To them, she was still the quiet girl who obeyed without question. But tension had begun to slip into the household like a slow leak of poison, unseen but steady, creeping into every cornered IT oft, and began with small moments, things that might have seemed harmless to someone looking from the outside. One evening, the mistress scolded Eliza for not pressing a gown to perfection. Her words sharp, meant to sting. Eliza lowered her eyes, accepting the scorn in silence, but inside, a pulse of rage spread through her chest. Another time, the master snapped at her in front of guests when she spilled a few drops of wine, as though her mistake were a personal insult. The laughter of the guests at her expense burned more deeply than the reprimand itself. The children, too, carried their parents' arrogance. One of the boys, no older than 10, delighted in mocking Eliza, calling her names, tugging at her sleeves when she carried heavy loads. He knew no punishment would ever reach him, and each cruel smirk reminded her of her place in their eyes. What unsettled Eliza most wasn't the boy's behavior, but how naturally it came to him, as though cruelty was something he had been taught without words, absorbed in the very air of the household. These slights might have been bearable on their own, but the weight of them, day after day, began to carve something sharp within her. She carried bruises not only on her skin, but deep in her spirit. Nights that once brought dreams of freedom now brought restless turning, her mind racing through endless thoughts of revenge, of justice, of escape. The family itself was not untouched by its own struggles. The master had debts he did not speak of openly. His gambling at private gatherings, whispered among other men in Natchez, had eaten away at his fortune more than his wife knew. He pressed Eliza and the other enslaved workers harder, demanding perfection in the home and fields, as if order in the household could disguise the cracks in his finances. His wife, sharp and proud, often reminded him of appearances. She wanted everything polished, every guest treated as though they were royalty. When the weight of her husband's failures pressed too heavily on her, she turned her frustrations on Eliza. Eliza became the vessel for every secret strain in that house. If the master was angry, he vented it on her. If the mistress felt shame or worry, she sharpened her tongue against her. Even the children mirrored the tension, snapping at her in ways they had learned from their parents. And though Eliza kept her face steady, she felt the storm brewing stronger each day. There was one evening when the family held a gathering in the parlor. Guests filled the house with perfume, laughter, and music. Eliza moved quietly among them, serving food, pouring wine, unseen except when she stumbled or delayed. That night, a man, a wealthy planter from nearby, remarked on her. He said she was a strong girl, fine-boned, with good hands for work. He spoke of her as though she were livestock, and the laughter that followed carried like a slap against her face. The master smiled, saying she was obedient, a credit to his household. Eliza said nothing, but inside her silence grew heavy, solid as stone. The Icehouse became her secret refuge. When the house was quiet and the family slept, she sometimes crept to its door. She would push it open and breathe the cold air, letting the chill sting her skin. The silence inside was so complete that it felt like a different world, one untouched by voices or commands. She imagined what it would mean if those who ruled over her with cruel hands and sharper words were locked inside, forced to feel helpless in the dark cold. These thoughts at first frightened her, but soon they became a strange comfort, a private rebellion she could never speak aloud. Old wounds also played their part in shaping her. She remembered her mother, who had once been in the same household, a woman of quiet dignity. She had tried to shield Eliza when she was younger, but illness took her quickly, and Eliza never forgot the way her master barely blinked when she died, as though her mother's life meant no more than a broken tool. From that day, Eliza carried a bitterness that never left her. It was not only her own suffering she bore, but also her mother's, a legacy of pain she could not lay down. The mistress, too, had her own fears, though she never admitted them. She feared losing her standing in Natchez, feared whispers about her husband's debts, feared the creeping sense that her world was not as secure as she pretended. Her sharpness with Eliza was, in truth, an attempt to hold on to control where she had little. But Eliza saw only the cruelty, not the fear behind it. Each harsh word was another strike against her patience, another reason to hate. By late autumn, the weather grew colder, the nights longer. The Icehouse no longer seemed so strange to imagine in her mind. It was not just a storage place anymore, but a symbol of something deeper, the place where power could shift, where the weak could trap the strong. The thought clung to her, growing sharper with every insult, every punishment, every reminder of her place. There came a night when the master struck her across the face for not responding quickly enough to his command. The sting of it lingered, but worse than the pain was the humiliation of being hid in front of his wife and children. Their eyes on her burned hotter than any bruise. That night, as she washed her face in the dark, she felt something inside her snap. It was as if all the years of silence had piled too high, and now the weight broke her stillness apart. From that moment, she began to move differently. She was still obedient, still quiet, but her eyes carried something colder. The family, wrapped in their own problems, did not notice. But within her, the plan was forming. Every trip to the Icehouse, every time she felt the door close heavy in her hand, became part of it. She no longer only thought of what it would mean to trap them. She began to wonder how she might do it. The household went on, unaware. To them, Eliza was still the same girl in the background, useful but invisible. But the walls of the house no longer felt as strong as the master believed. His debts, his wife's pride, his children's cruelty. None of it could shield them from what was growing just a few steps away, in the quiet heart of the girl they had overlooked for too long. The air in Natchez grew colder, and in that chill, Eliza's thoughts hardened. The storm inside her was no longer a passing shadow. It had become a force, waiting only for the right night, the right hour to break free. The night it happened carried a kind of stillness that made every sound sharper, every shadow deeper. A frost had crept into the air, and the wind scraped against the shutters of the big house. Inside, the family moved as they always did. Dinner served, arguments hushed, children sent to their rooms. The mistress had complained about the cold, ordering Eliza to fetch more blankets for the beds. The master had been drinking, his voice louder than usual, his temper short. The children, restless and spoiled, had left their toys scattered across the parlor floor. To anyone passing by, it looked like a household settling in for another night. But for Eliza, this was the moment she had been waiting for, the night when silence would finally give way to action. She had thought about it for weeks, every detail running through her mind as she worked. She knew their habits, their weaknesses, the way they trusted the walls of their own home to protect them. She knew how the Icehouse door shut tight, and how its heavy latch locked from the outside. She had stood in its doorway countless times, feeling the cold rush against her skin, imagining what it would mean to trap someone inside. That night, the thought became more than imagination. The IT began with her master. He barked at her, demanding she bring him more wood for the fire. His words slurred with drink, his anger spilling into every command. Eliza obeyed, but with each trip to the woodpile outside, her plan settled deeper. She waited until the house had quieted, until the mistress had finished complaining, until the master's temper had dulled into drunken muttering, until the children were half asleep. She moved softly, her steps careful, her face unreadable. No one suspected anything. Why would they? To them, she was invisible, incapable of thought beyond service. When she approached them, her voice was steady, even gentle. She told the mistress the master wanted them all to see something he had stored in the Icehouse. It was a simple lie, but believable. The Icehouse was his pride, a sign of his wealth and reach, a place where he sometimes boasted about the imported ice that survived the Mississippi heat. The mistress grumbled but rose, pulling her shawl tight. The master, half-dazed, followed, muttering curses at the cold. The children, curious and restless, came along, their small feet scuffing against the ground. The air outside bit at their faces as they crossed the yard. The moon hung pale above them, casting silver light across the grass. The icehouse loomed ahead, its thick walls dark against the night sky. Eliza walked slightly ahead, her hands steady though her heart hammered inside her chest. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now, with every step, the weight of it pressed harder against her ribs. The mistress was the first to complain about the cold. She urged Eliza to hurry, her voice sharp in the still air. The master shoved the door open, grumbling at the blast of icy air that poured out. One by one, they stepped inside, the children laughing at the frosty breath that escaped their lips. The mistress shivered, wrapping her shawl tighter. The master, unsteady on his feet, leaned against the wall, muttering about the chill. Eliza stood at the door, her hand brushing the thick wood. For a brief moment, doubt flickered. She thought of what it would mean, of the cries that would come when they realized, of the silence that would follow. She thought of her mother, of the years of humiliation, of the slap that burned her skin only nights ago. And in that moment, the doubt hardened into resolve. She stepped back, pulled the heavy door shut, and slid the latch into place. The sound was sharp in the night air, final, like a blade driven into stone. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the voices inside, confused at first, then sharp with anger. The mistress called her name, demanding she open the door. The master's voice rose, slurred but forceful, threatening her. The children began to cry, their small fists pounding against the frozen walls. Eliza stood outside, her breath rising in the cold, her heart beating so fast it felt like it might tear from her chest. She heard their fists against the door, the wood groaning under their blows. She heard the fear creeping into their voices, the shift from anger to panic. The mistress screamed, the master cursed, the children sobbed. The sound of them together, trapped in the darkness, shook the air like a storm. Inside, the cold would already be sinking into their bones. The icehouse was unforgiving, its chill biting deeper with every minute. Their breath would cloud the air, their skin would sting, their bodies would shake. The mistress's voice broke into sobs, pleading now instead of commanding. The master shouted threats, his words faltering as his strength weakened. The children begged, their cries piercing through the thick wood. Eliza pressed her hands against the door, her body trembling. She felt the wood vibrate with their pounding, with their desperation. For a moment, she closed her eyes, listening to every sound, every word. She did not answer. She did not move. She let their voices wash over her, a storm of anger, fear, and grief. The night stretched on, and their cries grew weaker. At first, the pounding was constant, frantic, a storm against the door. Then it slowed, the voices breaking into hoarse whispers. The mistress's pleas turned into prayers. The master's curses faded into silence. The children's cries grew faint, trembling sobs slipping into quiet. Eliza stayed by the door for hours, her body stiff from the cold, her mind locked in place. She listened until the silence was complete, until the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Only then did she step back, her legs heavy, her chest hollow. The icehouse stood still and dark, its walls hiding the family that had once filled the house with demands and cruelty. She walked back across the yard, the frost crunching under her bare feet. The house loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly with the last light of the fire. Inside, everything looked the same. The chairs in their place, the dishes stacked neatly, the silence of a home at rest. But the air felt different, emptier, as though the walls themselves knew what had happened. Eliza sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling in her lap. She felt no triumph, no joy, only an aching quiet pressed heavily in her chest. The cries still echoed in her ears, the sound of their fear carved deep inside her. She had wanted freedom, justice, revenge, but what she felt now was something far more complicated in the hours that followed. The house remained silent, as if holding its breath. The night was cold, the wind sharp, but Eliza did not move. She stayed there, listening to the faint crackle of the fire, the memory of the pounding door still alive in her bones. The family was gone, locked away in the frozen dark, and for the first time, the house belonged to her. But freedom, she realized, was not so simple. The silence pressed against her like another set of walls, and in that silence, she won. Dared what would come when the sun rose, and Natchez awoke to find one of its proudest families vanished into the ice. The morning after the Icehouse went silent, Natchez woke as it always did. Smoke curled from chimneys, wagons rattled down the dirt roads, and the river carried its steady hum past the bluffs. But inside the grand house, something was terribly wrong. The silence stretched too far, heavy and unnatural, as though the walls themselves were holding a secret too large to bear. The master, the mistress, and their children had not come down for breakfast. No laughter, no shouting, no orders barked through the hallways. Only Eliza moved about, her steps slow, her hands trembling as she set dishes on a table no one would ever sit at again. The tea first. No one outside the house noticed. Neighbors assumed the family was keeping to themselves. Servants and field hands whispered among each other, their eyes searching Eliza's face for answers she would not give. By the second day, visitors began to call, curious about the quiet. The mistress had been known to appear daily in town, her presence impossible to ignore. Her absence was strange enough to stir talk. By the third day, the whispers turned to worry. Men from nearby estates rode over, demanding to know where the family had gone. Eliza met them at the door, her face composed, her voice soft. She told them the master and his family were away visiting relatives, that she was left behind to tend the house. Her calmness unsettled them, but her words seemed believable. The truth, however, did not stay hidden for long. A sharp-eyed neighbor grew suspicious after noticing no carriage tracks leading out of the yard. Another remarked that no letters or words had arrived from the supposed relatives. By the end of the week, a group of men forced their way onto the property. They searched the house first, finding it too pristine, too still. Then someone pointed toward the Icehouse, its door heavy with frost. Eliza's heart pounded as they moved closer, their voices rising in uneasy curiosity. When the door was pulled open, the truth spilled out in a rush of frozen air. The sight inside struck the men into silence. The master, the mistress, and their children were huddled together in the cold, their bodies stiff, their eyes closed as though trapped in a frozen sleep. The silence of death hung heavy in the chamber. One of the men gagged, another crossed himself, and a third backed away, his face pale with shock. Word spread through Natchez like fire on dry grass. By nightfall, the entire town knew. One of its most powerful families had been found dead, locked in their own Icehouse. Panic rippled through the community. Some whispered of an accident, a tragic mistake. Others, with darker suspicions, spoke of revenge, of punishment for sins they pretended not to see. All eyes soon turned to Eliza. She was the only one left alive, the only one who knew the truth of what had happened. Question after question pressed against her, men demanding answers, women whispering behind their hands. Eliza said little, her silence both a shield and a confession. Inside her, the weight of what she had done grew heavier with every passing hour. At first, there had been only the ringing echo of their cries, the sound of fists pounding against wood. Now, there was emptiness, a hollow place inside her chest that no amount of quiet could fill. She had imagined Frito, and would taste sweet, that justice would feel clean. But instead, it was tangled with guilt, fear, and something she could not name. The law did not move quickly in Natchez when it came to crimes involving enslaved people. Yet this case was different. The dead were wealthy, respected members of the community who had hosted countless gatherings and built their name on power and control. To the town, their deaths were an outrage, an insult to the order that held Natchez together. Eliza was seized, her wrists bound, her body dragged before men who stared at her not as a girl, but as a monster. Some demanded her immediate execution. shouting for blood to answer blood. Others, quieter but no less firm, said she should be made an example of, her act proof of what happens when those born into servitude dare to rise against their masters. In their eyes, the crime was not only against a family, but against the entire system that kept them in power. Eliza's silence, her refusal to explain or beg, only fed their fury. The enslaved community, though, whispered differently. In hushed voices at night, in corners away from white ears, some spoke of her with awe. They said she had done what no one else dared, that she had turned the tables on those who thought themselves untouchable. Others feared her, saying the price of her act would fall on them all, bringing harsher punishments, stricter chains. For them, Eliza's crime was both a spark of hope and a warning of danger. Eliza herself drifted between numbness and regret. Alone in a cell, the stone floor cold beneath her, she replayed the night again and again. She remembered the sound of the latch sliding into place, the voices on the other side, the silence that followed. Sometimes in the dark, she almost reached for the door in her mind, imagined opening it. But she never let herself fully picture it. What was done could not be undone. The town changed in the wake of the crime. Where once people had boasted of their wealth and entertained with pride, now there was suspicion in every corner. Planters locked their doors tighter at night. Some treated their servants with sudden, nervous kindness, as though afraid of what silence might be hiding behind lowered eyes. Others grew harsher, their punishments more brutal, determined to remind the enslaved of their place. The balance of power, though still heavily in the hands of the wealthy, no longer felt as unshakable as before. For the children of Natchez, the story of the Icehouse became a whispered ghost tale, a warning not to disobey, not to wander too close to the frozen building that stood on the hill. For the adults, it was a scar, a reminder of vulnerability they preferred not to admit. The master and his family, once proud and untouchable, were now remembered less for their wealth and more for the way they had died. Huddled together in the cold, betrayed by someone they never saw as human, Eliza's name passed through every mouth, twisted in every retelling. To some, she was a demon, a girl without soul or mercy. To others, she was a symbol, proof that even the lowest could strike back against those who held the whip. But to Eliza herself, she was only a girl caught between silence and survival, carrying the unbearable weight of what she had done. As the days passed, and her trial loomed, she sat in her cell listening to the River O. Outside, its steady flow mocking the chaos in her mind. The world around her buzzed with judgment, but inside, she felt only the echo of the Icehouse, cold, dark, and silent, as though part of her had been locked in there too. The aftermath of her act stretched beyond her own life, reaching into every corner of Natchez, reshaping the way people looked at each other, reshaping the way they feared, loved, and controlled. The grand house, once alive with light and music, stood empty now. Its walls, once polished with pride, held only shadows. The Icehouse remained, its doors shut, its silence thick. And in every whisper across Natchez, from the riverfront to the far plantations, the name Eliza lived on. Not just as a girl, not just as a servant, but as the one who had shattered the illusion that power was forever safe behind locked doors. The trial of Eliza came swiftly, though no one doubted its outcome before it even began. In the crowded courthouse, she was brought forward in chains, her face calm, her body thin from sleepless nights. Men filled the benches, their voices low with anger and disbelief. Women clutched at their shawls, whispering about the cruelty of what she had done. The children of Natchez, forbidden from attending, still hung close to doorways, hoping for glimpses of the girl whose name had become a warning. The charges were read, and though Eliza never denied them, the trial dragged on for appearances. Witnesses spoke of her silence after the family vanished, of the lies she told about them traveling to relatives, of how she was found tending the house alone. Each word painted her darker, less human, a shadow who had dared to break the order of things. The defense was almost non-existent. She was a slave girl, her life worth less than the ink used to record her guilt. The verdict came as expected, guilty. The sentence was death. The court declared that such a crime could not be tolerated, but the punishment must be swift and severe. For the powerful men who ran Natchez, this was not only about Eliza, but about reasserting control. Her act had sent tremors through their system, and they needed to prove that the balance of power remained untouched on the day of her execution. The town gathered, their eyes hungry to witness. Some came with hatred, believing justice was about to be served. Others came with curiosity, eager to see the girl whose name had unsettled their nights. Among the enslaved, many came too, their faces set in silence. They could not cheer, they could not weep openly, but in their eyes flickered something more complicated, sorrow, pride, and fear all bound together. Eliza stood before them, her hands bound, her eyes steady. She spoke no words, not of regret, not of explanation. Her silence unsettled many, as though she carried something they could never touch. When the moment came, the crowd gasped, some satisfied, others uneasy, and then it was over. The girl who had dared to lock her master's family away in the cold was gone. But the story did not end with her death. Natchez itself was changed. In the months that followed, the grand house stood empty, its shutters closed, its halls gathering dust. The Icehouse, once a symbol of wealth, became a place no one wished to look at. Children dared each other to run near it, their laughter mixed with fear. For adults, it became a mark of shame, a reminder of what had happened when the line between power and powerlessness was crossed. The enslaved community carried the story differently. In their whispers at night, they told it not as a tale of horror, but as one of defiance. Eliza's name became more than a curse. It became a symbol. Some spoke of her with reverence as if she had done what others only dreamed. Others warned that her fate showed the danger of resisting too openly. Yet all agreed she had changed something, even if only in the quiet corners of their hearts. For the white families of Natchez, the lesson was drawn differently. Some tightened their grip, fearful that other servants might rise up. Punishments became harsher, rules stricter, eyes sharper. Others, shaken by what had happened, began to treat their slaves with a wary kindness, not out of compassion, but from fear of the silence that had lived in Eliza's eyes. Power was fragile, and though they tried to patch it, the cracks remained. What lingered most was the question of justice. The court had declared it served, but justice in Natchez was never equal. A family who had built their lives on the backs of others had died, and a girl who had known nothing but cruelty had been put to death for taking her chance at revenge. Was that justice, or simply the system protecting itself? To many, the answer was clear, though none dared speak it aloud. In the end, Eliza's story became less about the act itself and more about what it revealed. It showed how deep the divide ran between those who owned and those who were owned. It showed the cost of silence, the weight of humiliation carried for too long. It showed how power, when pushed too far, could crumble not with a roar, but with the quiet closing of a door. Morality in the story was tangled, difficult to hold. Was Eliza a murderer, or was she a girl who had been driven past her limits? Was her act cruel, or was it the only way she knew to make them feel what she had felt her entire life? These questions did not fade with her death. They lingered in Natchez, in the way people spoke of her name, in the way they avoided looking at the Icehouse, in the way fear and respect mixed when her story was told. The broader society did not change overnight. Slavery continued. Laws remained harsh, and those in power continued to protect themselves. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Eliza's act became one of those quiet reminders that no system, no matter how strong, was unshakable. That even the most silenced voices could strike with force. And that power, when abused for too long, could turn in on itself. As years passed, the details blurred. Some said she tricked the family, others that she forced them inside. Some said she laughed as she shut the door, others that she wept. The truth became harder to separate from the telling. But the heart of it remained. A girl who had been treated as nothing had shown the world she was something, Even if it was through an act that left her name bound to both horror and and the quiet reflection that followed, her story stood as a mirror. It reflected the cruelty of the system, the fragility of power, and the complexity of human behavior. It forced people to ask not just what she had done, but why. And in that why lay the uncomfortable truths of Natchez, of the South, and of the human heart itself. The Icehouse still stood long after the house itself crumbled. Its door, heavy and weathered, became a silent monument to the night when silence broke, when power was reversed, when justice and revenge became indistinguishable. And in every whisper of her name, whether spoken with hatred or with secret reverence, Eliza lived on. Not just as the girl who locked her master's family in the cold, but as the reminder that even the most fragile voice can echo against the strongest walls.